Today we're talking about Cthulhu. Of course we are. Today I want to talk about one specific aspect of Cthulhu, and that is his current balance. Now, we haven't seen him on PTS yet, and I'm well aware of that, but I've seen a lot of people say that they think Cthulhu is very overpowered and the strongest release that we ever had and all kinds of stuff like that. And when I initially looked through his kit, I was under the same impression. But of course, a first impression doesn't always necessarily adequately cover something. And we will, of course, have PTS soon as well, so we will be able to look at him more closely. But even on PTS, typically you can't really find out how balanced a character is exactly, because there are various factors coming into play that you won't have on the live servers. For me personally, it's lag, especially. For other players, also that they're matched very unevenly during those games. So often the result that you have at the end of PTS is not what you see when people get into the game. And I figured what I want to do for this release, and if you guys like it, maybe also for future releases, is have a closer look at the numbers before the guide comes even out, before PTS goes up, and try to get a little bit more out of it, as well as the other effects that he has, of course. So what I want to do is I want to look at his damage and his scalings and cooldowns as one thing and compare that to some other guards. I want to look at all the utility that includes CC and buffs for himself and allies and debuffs and everything that he has. And I want to look at his ability speed, like how long the wind up of all his abilities is, how long it takes for them to be deployed in the first place, and how long they are channeled or whatever, just to see if the kit is fast overall or slow, or if particular aspects that maybe seem very strong are relatively slow to deploy. And based on that, I want to get a better picture, a better first impression of how balanced or unbalanced this character really is, rather than just relying on the first glimpse that I had at the numbers. In order to do that, we first of all have to have Cthulhu's own numbers. So I have listed all of them here. His first ability is Sanity Break, with 270 base damage and 40% scaling on a 10-second cooldown. Damage not that high, but the cooldown is very low here. His second ability is the Mire, which, if you hit both shots, has 460 damage and 60% scaling on a 14-second cooldown at max rank. Initially it starts with 18 seconds. This is, however, also the ability that I think most people will max first. His third ability, Rushing Terror, has 240 base damage and 40% scaling on a 16-second cooldown. The ultimate comes with 340 base damage and 50% scaling on a 100-second cooldown. Keep in mind, with all these numbers and the numbers that follow, they are all for level 20, so this doesn't really represent how his power scaling is throughout the game, so we can't really determine his power curve from this, just his endgame potential. And then the three new abilities he has after the ult are: the first one, Sever, 350 base damage and 30% scaling on a 1-second cooldown because it replaces his basic attack. Second, Devastate, which is 280 base damage on a 20% scaling with a 5-second cooldown, still very, very short. And the third one is Transfuse with 200 base damage and 20% scaling on a 6-second cooldown. That brings the damage in his base kit, so if you just use the 1, 2, and 3, to 970 base damage and 140% scaling with 40 seconds cooldown afterwards. That is at least not absurdly high for a character with 3 damaging abilities, I can say that much at this point. If we include the ultimate, then the base damage goes up to 1310 damage with 190% scaling and 140 seconds cooldown. If we go for the total, including all of the abilities that you have after using your ultimate once, so basically you fire off all 3 abilities, go into your ult and fire off 3 abilities again, then the total damage would be 2140 with 260% scaling. This is of course assuming that every single ability fully hits. His damage potential can go beyond that, but we'll get to that a little bit later. First, we're going to do a comparison with other characters that can kind of be compared in a way. The first one that I wanted to see was Artio, because she is a stance-swapping guardian as well, even though her stances work very differently. And in this case, her total base damage is 1055, because she has 4 damaging abilities, with 195% scaling and 58 seconds cooldown. So what you can see here is that Artio's base damage definitely falls off drastically, and her scaling can keep up until Cthulhu starts using abilities in his ultimate, but even then that doesn't keep up anymore as well. And the overall cooldown for her is shorter between her abilities, which is nice. And of course, she has a lot of other gimmicks because she has multiple parts of her kit that are not focused on damage. But she is definitely not a competition in terms of damage for Cthulhu at all. The next card that I wanted to throw in the ring here is Cerberus, because he has insanely high damage for a Guardian, and he doesn't have anything that complicates things massively, like percentage health damage or something. If you hit everything perfectly with Cerberus, including all ticks of the 2 and a fully charged 1 on a target, plus the 3 in the ult of course, you'll end up with a total of 1556 base damage and 258% scaling on a 149 seconds cooldown. This is very close to the scaling of Cthulhu, but still pretty far apart when it comes to base damage. It still has roughly 600 less. We do, however, have to keep in mind that with Cerberus specifically, especially if you go for this combo, you will apply Protection Shred to the enemies, and you will likely apply it at the start of the fight with the 2, because you use it to activate the 1 as well. This 54 flat Protection Shred can in some situations make the gap in terms of damage much smaller here. And then I wanted to look at Cuchulainn, not so much at the scaling here, but rather at the base damage, because obviously physical and magical scaling isn't really comparable. Looking at his kit, we can actually see that in terms of the base damage of the 1, 2, 3, it's very close in base damage to Cthulhu. It's literally just a 10 difference. We have 960 here. Including the ultimate, the base damage for Cthulhu's kit is actually a little bit lower, because Cuchulainn reaches 1435. When it comes to the total damage, Cuchulainn is actually way ahead when it comes to base damage. He has a total base damage of 2870. How can that be? Well, I had to factor in the 2 somehow, and the 2 unfortunately is completely dependent on how long you stick to the enemy, and I just had to assume here that this is for the full duration. If you lower this number, then obviously his overall damage output will also go lower. That said, the 2 has a total of 360 base damage in each form, so you would still be around a similar damage area to Cthulhu if you completely excluded the 2. You would on the other hand be on a relatively higher cooldown with 238 seconds, and I would say Cuchulainn's kit is also a little bit more single target focused than Cthulhu's. Now some of you may be wondering why I didn't include Fafnir as a comparison here as well, and that's because his damage just works very differently, because a lot of his damage in his dragon form comes from his basic attacks as well, and that makes it very hard to measure it here. Now the problem is that this isn't really all of Cthulhu's damage. This is just assuming he drops his entire kit on someone instantly, basically. But Cthulhu, A, has a lot of large AoE damage, not only in his ultimate form, but even in the normal form. The Mire is a very large radius, and the Sanity Break seems to be okay to hit on multiple targets, and the Rushing Terror also seems to be okay to hit on multiple targets. So really, he can easily amplify these numbers, and he also has incredibly low cooldowns in his ultimate. Sever, in fact, the basic attack replacement, is on 1 second, with an insanely high base damage in my opinion. I think this is something that should definitely be looked at. It's AoE, high base damage, 1 second cooldown during the ultimate, and I can't really see how that can be balanced, even if it was super hard to hit, because it's such a high, consistent AoE damage value that doesn't even cost mana. And then once your ult is maxed out, you can even use Devastate and Transfuse 2 to 3 times per ultimate, so those are going to be very impactful as well. It definitely helps to understand his utility beyond all this as well, because he has loads of utility in his kit that is tied to damaging abilities, whereas many other support-ish characters at least have their utility in separate abilities quite often. See for example Artio or Fafnir as well. When it comes to soft crowd control, he has an attack speed slow of 30% for 6 seconds, he has a movement speed slow of 10% and of 35% for 3 seconds or longer, and he has a root for 1 second. In terms of hard crowd control, he has a fear for 1.5 seconds, he has a stun for 0.4 seconds, and that's combined with a knockback, so more a disrupt overall than a real stun or knockback. It just pushes you aside. But this also means, as somebody pointed out in the comments yesterday, this basically overrides enemy CC. If the enemy tries to knock you back and you use this ability at the same time, they will be the ones getting knocked back, much like with Hercules' stun knockback combo. So something that is very beneficial in many matchups and counters many guards. And he also has a knock-up in his ultimate. Many of these don't have a long effect, but they are all there and they give him all these ways to disrupt the enemy. In terms of self buffs, he has 30% extra health for up to 16 seconds during his ultimate. He has 20% or more damage mitigation, either for 6 seconds in his 1 or for up to 16 seconds in his ultimate, and that is something you can increase by using the ability a lot. And he has 80% damage mitigation at the start of the ult, which you can also use to specifically avoid big enemy ults, for example. In terms of buffs for others, he has 14% max health healing for allies, and this is based on their own max health. He can give them 40 power and 20% movement speed for 3 seconds. And he also has a debuff where he can reduce enemy protections by 3% up to 5 times for 5 seconds. So he can make allies apply more damage in multiple ways, he can make them chase better, he can heal them as well, he can make himself super tanky, and he has a whole set of both soft CC and hard CC. That is a pretty insane mix for a character that doesn't even dedicate specific abilities to only CC or only buffs. And especially the 80% damage mitigation at the start of the ultimate is something that I find very surprising. I think that he needs some weak points, and I think the wind-up of the ultimate would be a very justifiable weak point. I also find it rather surprising that he has a percentage heal put into his kit that he can even use multiple times during a single ultimate. That said, his abilities are not exactly swift. I had a look at the gameplay footage that we were shown, and a lot of his kit is actually rather slow. I think his quickest ability is his 1, but that requires you to basically be in melee range, so it's pretty clear when he's gonna try and use it. His second ability has roughly a 1 second wind up before anything happens, and you also have to channel it for 3 seconds, so you have to place it right in order to get things right with it. And his third ability is also not instant, it's a dash, but it has a little bit of a wind up before he starts dashing, and the range is also relatively short, especially for the center part with the knockback. His ultimate has a relatively short wind up considering what it is. It's roughly 1 second and a little bit, but again, you have a massive amount of mitigation during that. And the abilities during the ultimate all have a long wind up. Even the basic attack takes quite a while to deploy essentially. And the second ability seems like it's similar to maybe Baba Yaga's ultimate when it was first released. That feels a bit quicker now. And then the third ability also has a very long wind-up of him channeling before enemies and allies get hit by it. Maybe somewhat comparable to Cuchulainn in his rage form using his ultimate here. What is surprisingly short is the return to his normal form after the ultimate, so he doesn't get punished much there. But aside of that, you can see that his kit generally is very slow, with a few notable rather short range exceptions. That doesn't mean it's weak though. He has plenty of setup for himself if he gets things going. He has plenty of ways to survive if things go wrong for him, so he's not getting punished much for having these slow abilities. And you can't just run away from him, because in that case you'd be consistently just running away from Cthulhu, which, especially if he's playing support, is definitely not what you want to do. There are just team fights that have to be fought at some point. He also has that massive amount of CC immunity, which we have to keep in mind during his ultimate, which is absolutely crazy. Having CC immunity for that long while being massively buffed and while being able to use multiple abilities different from, say, for example, Vaman. So yeah, he has got a lot. So in conclusion, between his realistic and potential damage output, his massive amount of utility, and his relatively slow abilities, my prediction is that Cthulhu will release towards the stronger side. How strong exactly and how overwhelming he may be to deal with heavily depends on how smooth the abilities will feel, how manageable the wind-up is, and how avoidable the abilities are in real play. Especially due to how the sanity break works, I think we will initially also not see his full potential, because when people practice that more and get that mitigation going better and actually read the abilities, which a lot of people won't even do in the first place, so you're already doing more than most, then the potential of the character will be a lot higher. I would not be surprised if this is intended by Hi-Rez, because I imagine they have so much hype around that release that they want this character to be strong at the start, so people aren't disappointed when they first play him, and then gradually scale him down a little bit when it comes towards the point where he can be played in ranked maybe. And they've left themselves a lot of open doors in that regard as well, because he would be incredibly easy to nerf. Increasing cooldowns of the ultimate abilities would already change a lot, because the base kit in itself isn't super overwhelming in my opinion compared to what the ultimate offers, and likewise values like damage mitigation or healing can very easily be adjusted and can have a massive impact on the performance of a character. And that is my impression so far, and based on the numbers that we looked at, I would say it goes in line with the impression that most other people had. We will find out more probably tomorrow when the PTS goes live and we can have a closer look at him in game. With that, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. Let me know if you want me to do this in the future for new characters as well. And if you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, so you'll be notified of all the upcoming Cthulhu stuff. Other than that, see you for the next one soon. Sloth, out.